there. And lastly, please make sure your cell phones are on silent so we give our author her undivided attention. So, we've been waiting several months for this event. I think we booked this, we usually book a month or two out. This one we booked in August, I think, because we knew it was going to be as big as it was. And plus, because of who is here standing next to me. Jana Zimmer was born in 1946, the only child of 2 Holocaust survivors from Czechoslovakia. They fled together from the communists to land in Canada after just a couple days after your second birthday, right? Wow, amazing. Wow, you remember much of it? She became a collage and mixed media artist after her mother came to live with her in 1995, which I'm sure, I hope you can talk a little bit about. And in her artwork, through text and image, she explores issues of memory, exile, and responsibility. Tonight, we're going to try to post some of the photos online here, and also they could try to do it on their phone as well, if possible, but mostly take a look at the screen here. But once again, please welcome Jana Zimmer. All right, so go ahead and tell me what images. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you all for being here. My family, my friends who were with me in Prague in 2007. Kathleen and Don are somewhere here, and Lois and Dennis, and I think Angela and Tenori all came to Prague with me and propped me up through the exhibits in the Czech Republic. Almost, what, 15 years ago. Thank you also to my publisher, Carrie Patterson, who has come up from Los Angeles, and to my stepdaughter, Lisa Solomon, without whom this would not have occurred, because she is a book person, and she introduced me to Carrie, who is the perfect publisher, I think, for this book. So thank you all. Explaining how and why the images in this book arose is a challenge, but I will say that from the time I was a child, what was done to my family in the Holocaust was a forbidden topic, and it has taken me this long to find a way to express what I need to say about it. As for my hopes for the book and what impact it could have beyond addressing my own dilemma, my son read the book last weekend, and he said something very simple but quite profound. He said, one death is a tragedy, but 6 million is just a number. So this multi-genre approach, excerpts of my parents' stories told by them, my own struggle in responding to the story, my words, my artwork, where words won't come, my appropriation of my dead sister's artwork, all reflect my hope that my family's story will resonate. Hi, Michelle. And keep the larger story real, and that it might help people to connect in the present in the way that a documentary approach cannot. The art and words in this book were over 50 years in the making. The documents that are part of it, or a part of the images, go back to the war. So I've struggled with how to present this tonight. Somewhere in the book, I say that my life has been like a Mobius strip, with themes repeating, challenges presenting, each time a little differently. And my own attitude toward this story has changed, because 25 years ago, the word epigenetics didn't exist. The notion that people can carry trauma in their genes wasn't widely discussed. So even though I experienced it, I do now believe that what my parents experienced actually changed my genetic makeup. I didn't have a name for it. Just as I was writing this today, my own earliest recurrent nightmare popped into my head for the first time in decades. In it, I'm a child. I'm dead but not dead. And I'm on a gurney being pushed into an oven. The dream is not in the book, but it came up today. I'm going to be talking about specific images in the book in relation to the story. Logistically, there are 2 ways you can see them. Either get on www.janazimmer.com on your phones and scroll through as I am speaking, Or if you have the book with you, I will indicate the page number for each image as I discuss it. I've also printed out the images in case we have a total internet failure. When you read this book, you'll understand why I always operate with 2 or 3 backup systems. A few words about the particular historical background. Before being deported to Auschwitz in the fall of 1944, both my parents, married to others, were prisoners for over 2.5 years in the Terezin ghetto. My mother was deported to Auschwitz in 1944, where she survived a selection by Dr. Mengele. My grandmother Bertha was gassed immediately. My mother was then sent to Freiburg, Saxony as a slave laborer, and finally was liberated from Mauthausen in Austria in May of '45. My father was separated from his wife and daughter and deported from Terezin to Auschwitz in June of '44, then was on the death march from Auschwitz to Gleiwitz in January 1945, took a detour to Bucharest to avoid the Russian army, and finally arrived home to Prague in May of '45. My parents met on my mother's birthday in October of 1945, and I was born in 1946. We immigrated to Canada when the communists took over Czechoslovakia in 1948. The Terezin ghetto is especially well known because there are many artists and musicians imprisoned there. There have been many books about it. That the Jewish prisoners managed to engage in a cultural life was a small miracle, but this was cynically tolerated by the Nazis for their own propaganda purposes. They wanted to pretend to the world that the Jews were not being mistreated. An Austrian artist named Friedel Dicker Brandeis intentionally brought art supplies instead of the personal possessions that she had been allowed to bring to Terezin, and held art classes for the Jewish children. Her work was an early form of art therapy. All but a few of her students were deported to Auschwitz and other camps and murdered. Their images and poetry have become quite famous. My half-sister Rita was one of those child artists, and she was gassed in Auschwitz with her mother Kitty in the fall of 1944. Rita's artwork was the first inspiration for my own. I was invited to exhibit my art in Prague at the Terezin Ghetto Museum in 2007, and in 2015 I went to Germany to exhibit with 2 other artists in Freiburg, the town where my mother had been a slave laborer. They were Helga Hoskova, who had been a child artist in Terezin herself, who by then was in her 80s, and Stephanie Bush, a young non-Jewish artist from Dresden. Neither of my parents spoke much about the war, but both wrote out their life stories for me at my request in about 1981. Fragments of these manuscripts also form an important part of the history. This was before the Holocaust was widely discussed, before the Holocaust Museum in Washington was constructed. I've been writing about all of this on and off for 40 years, as you will see in the book, mostly in very private journals and in poems, all but one never published. Most of my art and my process in the last 25 years has to do with finding my own voice to express what I need to express as a second-generation survivor. First for my parents, and now for me. And now I'm finally taking the risk of speaking about it. My dilemma as the child of survivors was succinctly expressed by Boris Cyrulnik, a child survivor and neuropsychiatrist, who said, 2 great dangers threaten the children of the Shoah. One is to speak about it, the other is not to speak about it. For the non-Hebrew speakers, of which I am one, Shoah is the Hebrew word for catastrophe. In this context, it refers to the Holocaust. This first image, which is at page 84 in the book, if you can't see it, yes, is called Full of Hope, No Hope. This was made for my Czech exhibition in 2007. This image is also about speaking and not speaking. When I asked my father to write his life story, it had been 40 years since he had lost his first family. He had said very little about them, nothing about the facts, let alone about the feelings. He wrote about arriving home after liberation. Before 7 a.m., we were in Prague on May 18th, 1945. Next morning, I took the train to Terezin, full of hopes that Kitty and Rita will be there. They were not. I found out that a few days after I left, the Germans put together a transport of our families, and nobody in Terezin knew where the transport went. Some people maintained that it went to Auschwitz. If that was true, there was no hope. I hoped they went somewhere else and they would return. There were still people returning from different parts in Europe, but considering that Rita was 12 years old, I was afraid of the worst. Unfortunately, it came to the worst. The collage element in this monotype, Full of Hope, No Hope, is from my father's handwritten account. The handprints are mine. When I was about 8, I found a picture of my sister Rita in my parents' bedroom. When my mother came in, she became very angry, took the picture out of my hand, and directed me never to talk about it. She said, never, never, never ask Daddy about her. So I didn't. And I didn't see the picture again until I was about 35. I was never able to talk about it with my father while he was alive. So there's a lot that's been hidden, shrouded in a silence so deep that I couldn't choke out the words about it even when I should have been able to as an adult. I still have trouble with speaking about it. I didn't start to make art until about 1995, 11 years after my father died, and when my mother came to live with us, my husband Richard, who I forgot to acknowledge, who she adored, absolutely adored. The first assemblage piece on page 98 is a small box. It was for an exhibit called Women Beyond Borders that was organized by a Santa Barbara artist, Lorraine Serena, who lives in Carpinteria still, I think. It was a worldwide exhibit. She distributed small boxes, 2 by 3 by 5 inches, wooden boxes she had made by a carpenter in Carpinteria, and received boxes from all over the world. And then this exhibit was a feminist work. This exhibit traveled, again, all over the world. I got into it by donating money for a box, and then she invited me to make my own box and submit it, which I did. So this piece is called For Rita, 1995. The girl on the cover is me at about age 4. I hid a photo of my father inside the box and attached some automatic writing, which is writing done with the non-dominant hand. I had done about 25 years earlier. I had been told that if you write with your non-dominant hand, truths will come out. I was afraid for anybody to read my thoughts. I began to make collage and monotypes for the simple reason that I have no talent for drawing, and I was uncomfortable with abstraction. I was fortunate that my parents had kept every family document they could save. They buried some, they left some with neighbors when they were deported. The oldest one was from 1829, the newer ones from the war. And after my mother brought this treasure trove to Santa Barbara, I scanned all these documents and photos into my computer and began to make collage. The Jews in Terezin were allowed to receive packages of food from the outside and were allowed to send postcards acknowledging the receipt. The Nazis did this as part of their propaganda program to convince the world that they were not being mistreated. My mother sent the cards because it was the only way they could let anyone know they were still alive. And even though the Nazis stole everything of real value before distributing the packages, I started to use the postcards and my parents' handwriting in my artwork. This first card on page 130 to 131 in the book was written by my mother and signed, written by my father and signed by Rita, or apparently signed by Rita. It says in English, "Dear Uncle, we are all healthy and in good spirits. Mother and grandmother live with my father in the Sudeten barracks. Greet my friends and think of me sometimes. Your Rita. Denk manchmal an mich. Think of me sometimes." I didn't notice until a couple of years ago that this was written on November 25th, which is my birthday. The monotype was made for the Prague Terezin exhibits, and the cards are at page 130 in the book. When I began to make, I had no inkling that these art forms, collage and printmaking, must have chosen me. This image was made from the postcards for the Prague exhibit. I use multiples a lot in Photoshop to to kind of capture the enormity of the losses, the numbers of people, and so forth. And I've always been fascinated with my father's handwriting. Both of these components are his writing. The printing and his handwriting is like a woven carpet. It's so regular. It's kind of unbelievable. And of course, the colors are the ghetto colors, yellows, that Eastern European yellow color of buildings, and of course the colors of the swastika, the red and the black. So, as I say, this form of printmaking, I feel, must have chosen me. It was a Czech poet and collage artist named Jiří Kolář who said it best. The world attacks us directly, tears us apart through the experience of the most incredible events, and assembles and reassembles us again. Collage is the most appropriate medium to illustrate this reality. I noticed that the early imagery having to do with my father and Rita is about fire. The colors are the colors of the buildings in the ghetto and the red-black of the swastika. I made my father's writing, as I said, an element of the artwork, and I used the pattern tool in Photoshop to repeat the words and phrases. The next image in the book is on page 144. Výstup. It's actually incorrectly translated. My Czech is very poor, for which I blame my father. He didn't want me to go to Czech language school like the other kids. Anyway, Výstup actually means to step up, and I used it to mean exit. It's a monotype with chine collé, and it's from an altered photo of Rita and my father walking together in Prague in 1937. This is collaged with a paper documenting my father's attempt to officially leave the Jewish religion in 1939, a few weeks after the Nazis occupied Prague. Sort of side story, my father claimed he was excommunicated because he had had a dispute excuse me, with the community taxing authorities, because the communities in Europe had the authority to tax their own members. And in about 1938, they called him in and said they had made a mistake, and they had audited him, and he owed them more money, and he told them that was their problem. So you don't get to do that with the IRS. But their response was to say, okay, well then you're excommunicated, and you're not a Jew anymore. Then he was deported. When he came back, hi Janet, when he came back in 45, and my mother wanted to be married by the chief rabbi of Prague. So they made him go through a conversion ceremony. That's his story. He liked to tell stories. So if you look at this document, it says he's leaving the Jewish religion right on there. I think this was within a few weeks of Hitler coming in. I think he was doing it for that reason, but there you go. This next image at page 181 is called Linen Napkin. And I used the same photograph. Is that not in there? No, sorry. Yeah, that kind of got locked up, I'm sorry. In any event, this is an image I started to collage directly onto materials. I had scores of napkins, linen napkins that my mother brought from Europe that we had kept, that we only used at Passover. And I started to collage onto them with a simple t-shirt transfer. So this is one, yes. It's the same picture of Rita and my father walking in Prague. Even though I know the truth of where Rita died, I find myself placing her and my father in different environments, using the same photos of them as a collage element. First, I had them walking through fire. Here I collaged them onto one of the linen napkins that my parents brought from Europe. I noticed afterward that it was not my mother's napkin, which I had thought, but it actually had belonged to my father's first wife, Kitty. The monogram is KT. So I reunited the three of them without knowing it. The image that is on the cover of the book is called Joseph and Rita in the Promised Land. I made this image at the time of my exhibition in Germany. It's the least grounded in reality or history. I placed my father and Rita in an environment that is made to represent the Promised Land. The olive tree is an emblem of Palestine. I indulged in imagining that they survived together. The handwriting in the background was my father's description of waiting in Terezin to be ordered onto the transport to the death camps to the east. Nobody knew when his time will come, is what he wrote. My father would have scoffed at my use of this background. He was never a Zionist, even after Auschwitz. He wanted to stay and be a secular Jew in Prague, as before. But when the communists took over, he got us out and we went to Canada. We could not get asylum in the United States. This is one of the reasons my husband has founded the Immigration Legal Defense Fund here in town. A lot of this work has been about looking for the place I belong. This in-between feeling is shared by immigrants and refugees all over the world. I have a chapter in the book called Diaspora. Wherever I travel, I seem to find the place that Jews lived or live. Havana, Singapore, North Africa, Europe, St. Petersburg. The French-Polish Jewish writer Henri Racimo said, "Mine are superficial routes along the railroad tracks of Europe through the paths of emigration and deportation. Our routes are diasporic. They do not go underground. They are not attached to any particular land or soil, nor do they lie at the bottom of a well in Jerusalem." In my artwork, I keep going over the same ground, using digital images of my monotypes, creating different backgrounds, different contexts. Nobody Knew is on page 19. This was one of the first monotypes I did in 2006 for my exhibits in Prague and Terezin, and I keep changing it and I incorporate it in multiple ways. In 2009, I used this background. Is there a problem with the monitor?
No, this is for people who can't.
Oh, sorry, okay, sorry. I keep changing it. In 2009, I used this background along with my mother's brother, my Uncle Fritz, as the central image in a series on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Fritz's son, my cousin Peter, was born in transit to Terezin and survived his first 6 months in the ghetto. His mother took him to Israel in 1949. He's my only surviving first cousin. This image, Our Olive Tree, is at page 81. Here, Fritz stands in multiples for an army of boys. They could be Palestinians or just as easily Jews. I had first started using my Uncle Fritz in collage with reference to my father's family. The text in this image on page 124, which is called In Pieces, is from a wartime document that they were required to fill out. It was called Juden Evidenzkarte, names, addresses, values of home, and so forth. The next image is A Land with No People. Is that there? Is that not on there? I think that might be missing. No, there it is. Okay. Yeah. It's called A Land with No People. It's at page 79 in the book. In this image, I took away Fritz's gun and I gave him a talit, or prayer shawl, evocative of Sephardic Jews. The title is a quote misattributed to Golda Meir. It was actually used by the early Zionists in the early 20th century to encourage immigration from Europe. The full quote is, "A land with no people for a people with no land." They acted on a belief that Palestine was an empty desert. Even though I used Fritz's face quite often, I didn't really shift away from my father and Rita's story until about 12 years after my mother's death. This piece, called My Mother's Hand, on page 105. The handwritten text in the piece is her description of the firebombing of Dresden in February of 1945. The slave labor factory was 30 kilometers outside of Dresden. I would say that that this is the time I started moving away from making a mark for my people, for survivors, and toward showing the emotions, allowing the emotions to come up. I wrote in the book, on one occasion, soon after she moved in with us, I took my mother to a lecture in town about the use of art therapy in nursing homes in England. Part of the program involved asking the elderly attendees to trace an outline of their hand, as children like to do, and paint it with watercolors. The idea was to bring up and resolve memories of trauma. My mother was reluctant at first because she was already legally blind and had always been very self-conscious about her lack of artistic ability, but she did try it. I traced my own hand and mixed the colors incorrectly so it appeared as a brown glove. My mother's hand was pink as the dawn. On the way home, she said conspiratorially, "I have something to tell you about the hand painting." "What?" I asked. "The brown color that you painted your hand reminded me of the color of the glove of the SS guard who hit me in Freiburg. We were being walked back to the barracks from the factory, and we saw the whole sky was bright pink and red. We knew that the British or the Americans must finally be bombing Dresden. I turned to my friend Hetty and said, 'This is what we've been waiting for.' I didn't know it, but the guard that was walking with us was a Sudeten German who understood Czech, and when he heard this, he hit me so hard I fell to the ground. But I said to myself, never mind. Now I know I will survive because the end of the war is coming." The next part is going back to Germany. From about 1999 to 2014, I developed a friendship with a German historian, Michael Dusing, who was a high school teacher in Freiburg, Saxony. He made it his life's work to document the history of the 1,000 Jewish women who had been sent from Auschwitz to Freiburg to labor in the Nazi airplane factory. My mother was prisoner number 54193. He wrote several books and created a history workshop. I gave Michael one of my prints for his book cover, page 178. This book was called Slave Labor for the Final Victory: How Jewish Women Were Enslaved to Build Hitler's Miracle Weapons. The cover image is the factory where my mother was forced to labor, and I superimposed her face. The Germans believed that this airplane was going to win the war for them, so it didn't. In 2014, Michael invited me, along with Helga Hoskova and Stephanie Bush, to exhibit in Freiburg. The next image is on page 190, Gloves Arado. It was the poster image for that exhibit. They printed it out at about 6 feet by 6 feet, and they had it in the front of this 13th century church in the town of Freiburg. It was quite an impressive entry. I used my mother's gloves and a letter written in May of 1944 describing the conversion of a porcelain factory that had been owned by a Jew to this airplane factory. Arado Flugzeugwerk was the name of the airplane company. There's a chapter in the book called Siblings of the Heart. It's about the relationships among the women, my mother's group of friends, and the unexpected siblings I have found myself in relation to this story late in my own life. This image on page 172, called Bread and Salt, is a collage of a fragment of my grandmother Elsa Cohn's recipe book and a drawing that I made. It was one of 3 successful drawings that I did. In her manuscript, my mother repeatedly talks about her group of friends in the camps. She talks about several women who had become pregnant in Terezin right before their deportation to Auschwitz. In Terezin, they were allowed to converse with their husbands. And they gave birth either in Freiburg or on the train or at the gates of Mauthausen. Please note that the Germans prohibited abortions for Aryan women, but if Jews did not abort, they were sent back to Auschwitz to be gassed. These women did not want to abort because they still hoped to survive and be reunited with their husbands. In 2015, right before I went to Freiburg for my exhibit, I was contacted by a British author, Wendy Holden, who wrote a book called Born Survivors about 3 of these miracle babies. One was born to Anka Nathan, whom my mother had written about. My mother also most likely knew the second woman, Shiska Lowenthal, because their prisoner numbers were 1 digit apart, so they probably stood in line next to each other at a given point. I've been in touch with both their daughters, Eva Clark and Hanneberger Moran. I talk about other second-generation connections that have popped up that are even more surprising. Even though these babies were born in the spring of 1945 and I was conceived in the winter of that same year, we are remarkably similar. This part of the story isn't over either. And so to the present, the final image I want to talk about is called Never Again. It's on page 123. This is actually an older image. I made it, I think, probably around 2009. And the handwriting is my mother's handwriting. She too had a very, very disciplined and unique style of penmanship. I've taken fragments of what she has written and made the columns again, never again, again, never again. In her case, she said, never forget that 17th of July, 1942. This was the date where her closest relatives, her uncle who had helped to raise her, his wife, and their two daughters, Lydia and another Rita Brand, were called to be deported to Auschwitz. Excuse me, they were called to be on a transport. They didn't know where they were going. I say in the book that my mother was so devoted, so close to her family that when they got their orders, when this small family got their orders, she went to the office, the person in charge of putting together the list, and asked, said that her family had been called, and the person in charge said, I can take your mother out. Her mother was ordered to go. I can take your mother out. I can't take out the others. And my mother said, I didn't know you could take anybody out. I wanted to get in. So she said she went home sadder and wiser. They discussed it with her uncle, and my mother and my grandmother stayed in Terezin until October. So I don't know where this story will end or where it might lead me. When I started to put the book together, I thought I was documenting the development of my feelings about the past. I wasn't thinking about contemporary threats or future threats. But I included this image in the book, this image of Rita in the book, Rita Brand, and used it multiple times to represent the threat we face again. Rita didn't survive. She died in Mali Trostinets with her sister Lydia and their parents, my great uncle Emil Brand and Aunt Nettie. 17th of July, 1942 is the date they were deported from Terezin. I keep returning to this girl and what she faces. I noticed that I put her in the same flames that I put my father and Rita.
Take some questions. Feel free to speak up with a comment or a question.
Fire away.
Right back here, go ahead.
Hi.
Hi. So we were the same, 1946 survivors, and thank you for speaking out, because I think that's the more courageous and the thing to do.
Thank you. May I know your name?
Sasha.
Sasha. And where is your family from?
My mother is German. She's from Cologne. My father is from Riga, Latvia. They were met in the Latvian ghetto and Dundaga concentration camp. Then escaped in '44. Were freed by the Russians on death row. There's lots of detail, obviously.
Yes.
I have the
I'm
same
sure
thing.
you have a book in you.
Well, I did a documentary.
Okay.
But,
Very good. What's the name of the documentary?
It's called Kupa, the Wedding Canopy, and it actually was 30 years ago on the Santa Barbara Film Festival. I just wanted to thank you because I think there's fewer of us, there are almost no survivors left, and I think we need to speak up more and more because the history is just going to repeat itself. And thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Bravo.
Yes.
Bravo.
Can you speak a little bit about your journey from once you decided to do a book to get it published?
Well, you reviewed the contract. Thank you.
But there was more.
Yeah. Well, what specifically?
Well, it's not that easy to find somebody to publish.
No, it's not. Well, the miracle is that our daughter, Lisa Solomon, who is in the book, I'm sorry, what is your official
I'm a sales rep.
sales rep? And so I emailed Lisa and said, here's what I've done. Can you think of any publisher that might be interested? And she gave me Carrie's name. And I say that Carrie is the best and probably the only right publisher for this. If you look at Doppelhaus Press and their titles, it's an amazing collection. So I was very lucky. I don't think I would have self-published, if you're wondering about that. I think, I needed for somebody to want to do it.
Yeah, well, there's so many good stories that never get told because you don't know who to talk to get it out there. So.
Yeah. Hi, I see Wendy. Did you have your hand up? Oh, you're just.
How long did this whole process take you from the beginning of the book, starting to write, to now, to today?
Well, I didn't acknowledge earlier, and I should have, that about, I think it's 4 or 5 years ago, my friend Carolyn Butcher suggested that I might be interested in joining a memoir writing group with Maureen Murdoch here in town. And Maureen welcomed me into the group, and obviously I started writing pieces about this, but I also, when you read the book, you'll see some of the writing actually goes back many decades. A lot of the writing about going to Prague and Terezin was actually written in 2007. A lot of what I wrote about going back to Germany in 2015 was journaling while I was there, and then taking that, and then other pieces. So it was, and I don't want to say I appreciated COVID, but I think that, COVID triggered the desire to put things in order. It wasn't just that I had the time. It was like, okay, get on it. So that's what led to it. Hi.
I understand that when your parents were alive, there were things that you didn't discuss. In looking back, are there things that you wish you would have, or things that are still on your mind? And if so, would you share anything?
Well, one thing that is a sort of a sadness is that my mother brought all these materials with her in '95 when she moved in with me, and we never really sat down and went through them together. Although my mother was more forthcoming, I think she talked to my daughter-in-law about it. My grandson's name is Max for a very specific reason that you will read about in the book, and it came about because of a conversation between Andrea and my mother, in which my mother told Andrea a story that was very important about the war. So my mother talked more then, in her very old age. There was just no way to talk to my father. There was no way. There never would have been a way. He was just that closed down about it. I made a mistake. I remember I described when I walked into the den in San Diego in 1964 during the Watts Rebellion. And my father was watching the television news of this violence and the rioting, and it was being described, of course, as, I think that the people were described as animals, and my father sat there rubbing his tattoo. And I walked in, and I think I said something to him like, have you ever thought of seeing a psychiatrist? It's like, oh my God, he could have just blasted me right out of the house with a hose. He could have done it. It was just not negotiable. But my mother was quite open, and in fact, my mother then sat for an interview with the Shoah Project, She was very excited because the interviewer who came up was a French actor named Robert Clary, and if any of you were soap addicts in your younger years, he was on Days of Our Lives, which my mother also watched. She was thrilled that he was her interviewer, and she was very open. I have her tape, and I played it after she died. That was our way of having a wake. We played that for friends. And so she got quite chatty about it. Harvey.
Hi, Jana. So I know you as a coastal commissioner.
Those were the days. I got a coastal commissioner right here, my buddy Brian Brennan.
That's guilty as charged.
So one of the things that struck me about your book, which I was unprepared for, is the directness and the honesty, the straightforward reasoning that goes through it. And I'm wondering, what is the relationship, if any, between you as a coastal commissioner, and I've also read your book, as you know, about
My coastal commissioner.
your coastal commissioner. Yes,
Read that and good luck.
I know the genre.
That one had pictures too. Yeah.
A little less artful, I might say. But, so I'd like to know, do you think, either autobiographically or biographically, that there is any connection between your sense of mind and way of thinking and working and interacting with other people in those two such different modalities of your existence?
Good question. Good question.
Professor.
Well, that is a very
I'd like to see a psychiatrist.
I'll say something about my mania about due process. That's a link, you know. And I think that although everyone was quite excited when my friends, you know, the community at large was all excited when I was appointed to the Coastal Commission, but at the end of my 4 years, they couldn't wait to see me go. Diane knows this, don't you? So, because due process, man, you know, even rich people have a right to a hearing. So the legal mind, if you're referring more to my legal mind, yeah, that's connected. And my mother, you know, my mother wanted to be a lawyer. And that was not an option for her. So she was very supportive of my legal work. And, you know, I started out wanting to be a civil rights lawyer and didn't find a job that was directly related to that. And that's kind of how I ended up in environmental law and land use law.
Do you think you're a bit outspoken?
I've never been told that. I've been told I'm an angry. But, you know, men are outspoken, women are angry bitches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about one more question?
Hi.
What I'm struck by in your story is also how these synchronicities happen in your art. And I'm just struck by the idea that you discover what the connections are through the art. That the family connections live in you and come out in the art. I just wonder if you might say something about that.
Can you give an example of the
Oh,
synchronicity
I
in
was
the
just
art?
listening to so many examples that you gave about, you know, birthdays, synchronicities with a birthday, with,
letters.
numbers next to each other with Rita
Yeah,
and your dad and.
yeah, there's a lot of, the shared stuff in there. And that you don't even, I don't, you know, aging is not fun, but there's some parts of it that are kind of interesting. And there's some place in the book where I say that, you know, I still haven't figured out my relationship to the, you know, eternal, if there is one. But what I said in the book was I had this strange feeling that somehow there was this fisherman that had cast out a net over my whole life and started bringing it all together. And I think that's, for me, that's the great gift of the book for me, is that I got to see this stuff, and it seems to keep happening more. I mean, I'm going to tell this story here, even though it's not so relevant to people here, but if you've read the book, you know it already, and that is when I got appointed to the Coastal Commission, by happenstance, they seated me next to this very elegant, tall, blonde woman. She was the wife of a producer. I had been told she was the wife of a producer. And I thought, oh, who's, you know, she got appointed because blah, blah, blah. I was prepared to intensely hate her. Because she was everything I wasn't, right? She was tall, she was blonde, she was not Jewish, apparently. And the first day on the commission was an extremely long day. Brian was there. We were like at 2 o'clock in the morning. It was 15 hours that day. And it was a tough, tough first day. And so Dana and I started kibitzing on the dais, and speakers would come up, and there were some very obnoxious characters who showed up at the Coastal Commission. And there was this one guy who sauntered up in this sort of beige suit with a cowboy hat and boots. And I turned to Dana and I said, if you were casting a movie, by the way, her husband was Stephen Bochco, who created everything good that was ever on television. And I said, and she worked with him. And I said, so if you were casting a movie, which actor would you cast in this role? And she said, oh, one of the lesser Baldwin brothers. So that was the beginning. And several months, and then we really got along. We had the same idiotic sense of humor. We both fell down laughing over Gene Wilder in Start the Revolution Without Me. That was our favorite movie. And a few months after we started going to the meetings together, driving together, and I would go back to her house. Stephen loved to hear the stories. We would always go out to dinner. And one Saturday morning, Dana and I were going for a walk, and I don't know how it came up, but something came up about that my mother had been in the camps. And Dana then said her mother, Helen, this is one of those synchronicities, her mother, Helen, had been a nurse. She had been a John Powers model. That's how Dana got so tall and gorgeous. And she had been a nurse, and she went around Europe with these nursing units after the liberation. And she said her mother had liberated one of the camps. And I said, well, which one? She said, I don't know. She said, I think it started with an M. And I said, was it Mauthausen? And she said, well, I don't know. Let's go ask her. Her mother lived with them. Her mother was then about 94, and sure enough, that's what it was. Wow. And then that was, so, you know, everybody thought Dana and I got close. You never knew this story. No. You haven't read the book yet. Yeah. Anyway, so, yeah, the synchronicities continue. In fact, I got an email from a woman a couple months ago. Are you the Jana Zimmer whose grandmother was Bertha Altschul? Yes. It's a woman named Joan Freed who lives in Lake Oswego. Oh my gosh. Portland, near Portland. It turns out she's the great-granddaughter of my grandmother Bertha's twin sister. So we're some kind of cousins. And but the amazing part of this is that my father had one brother, his oldest brother, who had left in 1939. And he got to the United States, and he spent the war in the States. After the war, he went to India for thought he was going to do business there. I knew him only because he came to Montreal in the 50s. He was sick and he died in Montreal. But she had letters in Czech and German from my Uncle Carl to her grandmother from 1939 to 1945. So now I'm off in this new rabbit hole of translating these letters, trying to figure out who's on first. My father always portrayed his brother as a big loser, you know. The brother portrays himself as a genius, ceramicist, you know, who's about to make his fortune. So, I don't know.
Well, Jana Zimmer, thank you very much.